In the winter of 1868, a young man stepped off a train in Boston after a journey of 4 days through a blizzard. He had travelled from the American Midwest by way of Montreal, sleeping one night on the floor of a stranger's hall bedroom, arriving at his destination with almost nothing in his pockets and everything he owned either left behind or lost along the way. He was 21 years old. The men at the Western Union office who saw him walk in that morning took him for a country curiosity. His hat was wide-brimmed and battered. His coat hung loose on a thin frame. His collar, the paper kind that men of modest means wore in those years, was soiled from the road. One of his colleagues later described him in these years as decidedly unprepossessing in dress, a young man who looked, in plain terms, like he had been sleeping rough. Another said he had the air of a mechanic. A third simply called him a jay from the woolly West. He was partially deaf. He had received, by his own account, approximately 3 months of formal schooling in his entire life, cut short at around age 8 when a schoolmaster in Port Huron, Michigan, declared within the boy's hearing that his mind was addled. His mother had pulled him from that classroom in a fury and taught him herself, reading him Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Hume's History of England, Shakespeare and Dickens, at a time when most women of her social position were reading fashion magazines. What the boy absorbed from those years of home instruction was unusual. A wide, hungry, undisciplined intelligence with no ceiling and no particular floor. By the time he arrived in Boston, he had spent 5 years as a wandering telegraph operator, drifting through Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Memphis, Louisville, and a half-dozen smaller towns, getting fired from most of his positions, not because he could not do the work, but because he could not stop tinkering with the equipment long enough to do only the work. He had arrived in New York at one point with less than $1 to his name, surviving his first days in the city on apple dumplings purchased with tea samples he had charmed out of a wholesaler on a side street near Washington Market. He had slept in a battery room beneath one of the great financial houses of Wall Street, listening above his head to the machinery of capital while he subsisted on 5-cent meals. None of this is unusual in itself. History is full of young men who arrived somewhere with nothing. What is unusual is what happened next. The men at the Boston Western Union office decided, on his first night on the job, to play a joke on the new arrival from Michigan. They arranged for him to be assigned to receive press copy from one of the fastest telegraph operators in New York, without telling him what was coming. The plan was to overwhelm him. Instead, he kept pace. When the New York sender began to deliberately blur and slur his signals, a professional trick used to throw off receivers, the young man from Michigan simply opened his own key and tapped back, with studied calm, a single telegraphic aside. Say, young man, change off and send with the other foot. That response is worth pausing on. It tells you something about the quality of attention this person brought to everything he encountered. He was not rattled, he was amused. And within the amusement was a precision that the fastest telegraph man in New York had not expected. Within 9 years of that Boston arrival, this same man walked into the offices of the Scientific American magazine in New York, carrying a strange metal contraption he had designed on a paper sketch and had a machinist build for $18. He set it up on the editor's desk, spoke a nursery rhyme into a small funnel, moved a lever, and the machine spoke the nursery rhyme back. The editor later wrote that the device introduced itself, politely inquired after their health, and bid them a cordial good night. The crowd that gathered to watch the demonstration grew so large, so quickly, that the editor became genuinely alarmed the floor of the building would give way beneath them. The man with the machine was described by those present as appearing almost as surprised as his audience. He had, he said, not entirely expected it to work on the first try. He told them it was called a phonograph. Nothing like it had ever been patented anywhere in the world. The United States Patent Office, when it received his application, granted it in the unusually short time of 57 days, because its examiners could find no prior art to argue with. The thing had simply never existed before. 2 years after that, on the night of October 21st, 1879, a thin thread of carbonized cotton glowed inside a glass globe in a laboratory in rural New Jersey. The globe had been exhausted to 1/1,000,000th of an atmosphere of pressure. The thread resisted temperatures that would melt most metals. It burned for 13.5 hours before it failed. The men watching it that night had become so accustomed, through months of repeated failure, to expecting things to go wrong that when this one did not, several of them simply sat in silence for a long moment before anyone spoke. 3,000 people arrived at that same laboratory on New Year's Eve of 1879 to see the lights burning in the fields. They came by train, by carriage, and on foot. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran special excursions from New York and Philadelphia. Farmers from neighbouring counties stood in the cold and looked at the lights on wooden poles along the roads, and said things that newspaper reporters tried to write down faithfully with varying success. And then, on the 4th of September 1882, in the financial district of Lower Manhattan, the man threw a switch in a squat iron building on Pearl Street and lit up a city. That same afternoon, while his colleagues stood in the dynamo room making history, he was out in the street with his coat off and his hands in a junction box, fixing a current leak under the pavement. A police officer came to tell him there was trouble at the corner of Ann and Nassau Streets, where a horse had reared up straight in the air after stepping on electrified cobblestones, and the crowd was yelling. He went to fix that too. He had accumulated, by the end of his life, 1,093 patents. The record still stands. His name was Thomas Alva Edison. But here is the thing about that name. You already know it. You knew it before you press play on this video. You have known it in all likelihood since you were a child. It is one of the most recognized names in the history of American technology, possibly in the history of technology full stop. There is a version of Thomas Edison that was constructed very deliberately, beginning in his own lifetime, and it goes roughly like this. A poor boy from the American heartland, denied schooling, working from the age of 12 to support himself, taught himself everything through sheer force of will and native genius, arrived in the great cities of the East with nothing, and through relentless labour, sleeping 4 hours a night, working the rest, invented the modern world. He was the self-made man in his purest form, honest, democratic, rough-hewn, indifferent to wealth, devoted only to the work, a latter-day Ben Franklin, but more productive, a folk hero for the industrial age. This version was not invented by his enemies. It was cultivated with considerable skill by Edison himself. He understood earlier than almost any inventor of his era that public perception was a resource, something that could be managed and deployed the same way a dynamo could be managed and deployed. He gave interviews at strategic moments. He made promises to newspapers that were not yet true. He allowed fables about his poverty and his perseverance to circulate without correction. When reporters arrived at Menlo Park looking for the wizard, he gave them the wizard. The rumpled clothes, the plain speech, the homely manner, all of it was real. And all of it was also a performance. And those two things are not contradictions. The legend served him well for decades. And then, sometime in the second half of the 20th century, a reaction set in. The second version of Edison goes roughly like this. He was primarily a businessman, not a scientist. He took credit for the work of his employees. He stole ideas from competitors. He treated Nikola Tesla, the true genius of the electrical age, with contemning ingratitude. He electrocuted animals for publicity. He tried to destroy alternating current technology because his own financial interests depended on direct current. He was, in this telling, less a hero of invention than a prototype of the modern corporate appropriator, someone who understood how to monetize other people's creativity and wrap it in his own name. This version also contains real material. Some of the specific charges are well documented. Others are exaggerated or stripped of context, or simply wrong in their details, while pointing at something genuinely worth examining. But the version itself, the full debunking portrait, has become almost as fixed and reflexive as the legend it replaced. In certain corners of the internet, it functions less as history than as a kind of corrective mythology, a story told not to understand Edison, but to diminish him, with Tesla elevated in inverse proportion. Both versions share a common flaw. They begin with a conclusion and work backward. The legend needs Edison to be essentially noble. The debunking needs him to be essentially fraudulent. Neither version is especially interested in the specific texture of what actually happened, in the actual sequence of events, the actual state of the evidence, the actual complexity of what it meant to be inventing things inside an industrial economy that was being built in real time without any existing model to follow. This documentary is working from a different starting point. The primary source underpinning everything you will hear in this series is a biography written by Matthew Josephson, first published in 1959. Josephson spent 3 years in direct study of Edison's original laboratory records, 3,400 notebooks, original patent sketches, and approximately 250,000 pieces of correspondence and memoranda, materials housed at what was then the Edison Laboratory National Monument in West Orange, New Jersey. He also interviewed Edison's 4 surviving children and had access to unpublished letters. He was not a hagiographer. He was a serious historian who had previously written a celebrated critical study of the Gilded Age robber barons. He admired Edison. He also held nothing back. That book is the backbone of what follows. Where other sources inform the account, that will be clear from context. Where historians disagree about specific events, and there are several genuinely contested points in Edison's life, both sides of the disagreement will be presented and the available evidence examined. What that evidence shows, taken whole, is a man who is neither the legend nor the debunking. It shows someone whose actual achievements were, in certain respects, more impressive than the folk story suggests, and whose failures and moral lapses were, in certain respects, more serious than the legend acknowledges, while being somewhat different in character from the version currently in circulation online. A few things are worth establishing clearly at the outset. Edison was not primarily a lone inventor. He built at Menlo Park and later at West Orange what his contemporaries recognised as genuinely unprecedented, a systematic, organised, well-staffed laboratory whose entire purpose was the industrial production of inventions. The men who worked there, Charles Batchelor, John Crucy, Francis Upton, John Ott and others, were not merely assistants. They were skilled, often brilliant collaborators who contributed materially to the work. Edison knew this. He rewarded them, imperfectly, with shares and bonuses. He also made sure, consistently, that the patents bore his name. The ethical weight of that arrangement is real and will be examined honestly. Edison was also not a pure scientist in the manner of Faraday or Maxwell. He had no patience for mathematics. He distrusted theoretical frameworks that could not be immediately tested against physical reality. His method was, in his own words, the method of the drag hunt. systematic elimination, thousands of trials, ruthless attention to what the evidence of experiment actually showed rather than what theory predicted it should show. This method produced the phonograph, the carbon filament lamp, and the carbon telephone transmitter. It also led him, late in his career, into a decade-long iron ore project that consumed most of his personal fortune and produced almost nothing. The same temperament that made him brilliantly effective in certain kinds of problems made him almost comically blind to others. Start with the blood, and the story makes more sense. The Edison family did not produce quiet men. They did not produce men who kept their heads down, accepted the prevailing order, and made their peace with whoever happened to be in charge. Generation after generation, across more than a century of documented history, the Edisons showed a remarkably consistent tendency to end up on the wrong side of whatever political conflict was nearest to them, not through cowardice or confusion, but through a kind of stubborn, almost aggressive commitment to whatever position they had already taken, regardless of the consequences bearing down on them. It is worth tracing this, because it is not incidental to the story of Thomas Edison. It is the substrate from which he grew. The first American Edison of record was a man named John, whose family had roots in the Netherlands and who arrived in New Jersey in the early 18th century. He married into the Ogden family, acquired a farm of 75 acres in Essex County, owned livestock and property, and by all accounts might have passed his life in comfortable provincial obscurity. Then the American Revolution arrived, and John Edison made his choice. He chose the king. This was not an unusual position in New Jersey in 1776. The colony was deeply divided, with a large minority remaining loyal to the crown, typically people of property, which the Edisons were. But John Edison went further than passive loyalty. He took up arms under General Howe, served as a scout against the Continental guerrillas in the wooded ridges of New Jersey, and was eventually captured by revolutionary militia and imprisoned in the Morristown jail. He was tried by New Jersey's Council of Safety on a charge of high treason, convicted, and sentenced to hang. He did not hang. His wife Sarah worked through every connection available to her, including relatives serving in the Continental Army, to secure his release. He was eventually paroled and sent back through the British lines to New York. When the revolution ended in British defeat, the consequences were total. All of the family's New Jersey property was confiscated. John Edison, his wife, and their children sailed from New York Harbour in 1783 as part of the gloomy British fleet that transported 35,000 American Loyalists to Canada and the West Indies. They were given a grant of bleak wilderness land in Nova Scotia on the Bay of Fundy and told to start again. They did. For nearly 3 decades, the Edisons worked the Nova Scotia forest, married, had children, buried children, and gradually built something resembling a life. Then, in 1811, the entire extended family, old and young, men and women, 19 people in total counting grandchildren and daughters-in-law, packed up again and moved to Upper Canada, to what is now Ontario Province. They travelled by ship to New York, then 800 miles overland by ox team and wagon through the summer, arriving at a stretch of pine land along the Otter River with no nearest white neighbour for 21 miles. They had been in their new settlement less than a year when, in January of 1812, a runner came over the snow to warn that war with the United States was coming. Samuel Edison, the eldest son, responded by raising a company of volunteers. He served as captain under Colonel Thomas Talbot, fought in the strange war that was waged on the lakes and in the forest, and acquitted himself well enough that his neighbours esteemed him for decades afterward. The pattern here is visible and consistent. A new country, a new conflict, and an Edison stepping forward to fight on the side that would, in retrospect, turn out to have been the losing one. The Edisons were loyal, fervently, stubbornly loyal, to whatever they had already committed themselves to. They were not people who recalculated when the odds shifted. Samuel Edison Sr. lived to 98, still fighting with his neighbours and his church well into old age. The records of his Baptist congregation note with some delicacy that after the steps of labour had been taken with a captain, according to the word of God, he was expelled for railing and refusing to obey the voice of the church. His wife Nancy was expelled shortly afterward for non-attendance. Neither of them appears to have been particularly troubled by this outcome. Their son Samuel Jr., Thomas Edison's father, inherited the family disposition in full. In the political disorders that shook Upper Canada in 1837, Sam Edison became involved on the losing rebel side and was forced to flee Canada suddenly and alone, leaving his wife and 4 young children behind in Ontario province while he crossed the border and established himself in Ohio. He settled in Milan, a small canal town on the Huron River, built a shingle mill with lumber shipped from Canada, and within a year had arranged for his family to follow him across. Sam Edison was not a reliable provider. He had his father's restlessness and his grandfather's appetite for schemes that looked better from a distance than they did up close. The observation tower he built in Port Huron, 100 feet of wood with a telescope at the top, from which tourists could admire the view of Lake Huron for 25 cents, earned $3 in its first summer. He was the kind of man who talked about opportunity constantly and captured very little of it. He hated the Grand Trunk Railway with a sustained passion for 10 years because one of its locomotives killed a cow of his, and he pursued the resulting lawsuit long after any rational calculation of costs would have suggested otherwise. What Sam Edison was, however, was present. He built things with his own hands. He was curious about the world and openly contemptuous of received authority. He read widely for a man of his background and education. His son Thomas would later recall, with a kind of wry affection, that his father once offered him a penny for every serious book he read, a bribe that worked better than Sam probably intended, since the boy spent the pennies on chemicals. Nancy Edison was a different order of person entirely. She had been a schoolteacher before her marriage at 18, and she brought to the raising of her youngest child a seriousness of intellectual purpose that was genuinely unusual for her time and place. When most women of her station were reading Godey's Lady's Book and the Rollo books to their children, Nancy Edison was reading them Gibbon. When her son was dismissed from elementary school as unteachable, she did not accept the verdict. She understood, by instinct or by observation, that this particular boy learned through his own curiosity and his own hands, and not through the imposition of lessons from outside. She gave him space and direction in roughly equal measure. "My mother was the making of me," Edison said late in his life. "She understood me, she let me follow my bent." There is every reason to take that statement at face value. Nancy Edison's health declined steadily through the years of Thomas's childhood, worn down by hard work, repeated family losses. 3 of her 7 children died in infancy, a 4th in youth, and the chronic stress of life with a man who was enterprising but not dependable. By the time her youngest son had reached his teenage years, she was already showing signs of serious illness, and by his early 20s, her mind had begun to fail. She died in April of 1871, while Edison was in the middle of his first burst of manufacturing success in Newark. He had not been home in 3 years. He hurried back to Michigan for the funeral, knelt at her grave, and then returned to work. The house on Choate Lane still stands. It is a 7-room wooden frame structure built into the side of a bluff overlooking the Huron Canal basin, constructed by Sam Edison with his own hands in 1841 using lumber from his own mill. Simple, solid, pleasingly proportioned in the Greek Revival style that was fashionable in the first half of the 19th century. From its lower kitchen windows you could once watch sailing ships and barges riding in and out of the canal roadstead across the flat green prairie. It is the kind of house that speaks of modest but genuine competence. A tradesman's home, built carefully, meant to last. Thomas Alva Edison spent the first 7 years of his life here, and then the family moved. Sam Edison's shingle mill business, which had looked so promising when the canal was being built, collapsed almost immediately after the railroad arrived in the region and made the canal obsolete. The town of Milan, which had briefly been one of the great grain shipping ports of the American interior, shrank back toward the rural backwater it had been before the canal came. Sam Edison, with characteristic restlessness and characteristic poor timing, moved his family north to Port Huron, Michigan in 1854, drawn by the prospect of a new railway line and whatever opportunities might cluster around it. It was in Port Huron that the boy's education, or rather the remarkable substitute for it, took shape. He entered school in the autumn of 1855 at the age of 8, enrolling in the one-room school run by a Reverend G.B. Engel. The experience lasted approximately 3 months. Engel used a leather strap as a teaching instrument and showed no particular patience for pupils whose minds moved along unconventional paths. One afternoon, the boy overheard the schoolmaster telling someone that his mind was addled. The word landed. The boy walked out of the classroom and went home and told his mother he would not go back. What Nancy Edison said to Engel when she came to see him the following morning has not been preserved in detail, but the substance of it is clear enough. She informed him that she knew her son better than he did, that she had taught children herself, and that she was removing the boy from his care. She then began teaching Thomas herself. This is sometimes presented as a purely triumphant moment, the enlightened mother rescuing the misunderstood genius from the ignorant schoolmaster. The reality was somewhat more complicated. Engel, 30 years later, wrote Edison a letter noting that he had never pressed Sam Edison for the small school fees he was owed because Sam was not very flush with money, and that now, having heard of Edison's great success, he wondered if the inventor might see his way to sending some assistance to a 77-year-old retired clergyman. Edison sent him a check for $25. The exchange is revealing on multiple levels and worth holding in mind. Nancy Edison was not a formally trained teacher. Her experience had been limited to a rural Canadian village school before her marriage. Her son never learned to spell correctly. His grammar, well into his adult years, was, in the measured words of Josephson, appalling. What she gave him was something different from formal instruction, and arguably more valuable for the specific kind of mind he had. She read to him seriously. She took his curiosity seriously. She understood, by whatever combination of instinct and observation, that forcing this particular child through prescribed lessons in the standard order was not going to work, and that the alternative was not abandonment but redirection. One day she placed in front of him a copy of R.G. Parker's School of Natural Philosophy, an elementary book of physical science that described experiments a child could perform at home. Edison later said it was the first book he had ever read that he genuinely understood, and that it felt less like studying than like playing a game he was actually good at. He worked through every experiment in the book. His mother then obtained a dictionary of science. He went to work on that too. By the age of 10, he had set up his first laboratory in his bedroom. Rows of bottles and chemical jars arranged on shelves, purchased with whatever pocket money he could accumulate, and was conducting his own experiments. His father disapproved. Sam Edison could not understand why a boy would choose to spend his days in a cellar with chemicals when he could be outside with other children. He offered Thomas a penny for every serious book he read, hoping to redirect his attention towards something more recognisably useful. The bribe worked after a fashion. The boy read the books and collected the pennies and spent the pennies on more chemicals. The cellar experiments were not always safe. The wet cell batteries spilled sulfuric acid on furniture and floors. There were muffled explosions that reached his parents from below. "He will blow us all up," Sam Edison reportedly exclaimed on more than one occasion. Nancy Edison's response, repeated often enough that it became a kind of family motto, was simpler. "Let him be. Al knows what he's about." It is worth dwelling on what he was actually learning in that cellar, because it was not nothing. He was learning, through direct physical experience, how electrical circuits behaved. He was learning what happened when you combined certain chemicals with certain other chemicals under certain conditions. He was learning that the gap between reading a description of something and actually making it work was real, important and bridgeable only through patient attention to what the experiment itself showed you. He was developing, without anyone telling him to, the habits of mind that would define his entire working life. Observe carefully, test everything, trust the result of the experiment over the prediction of the theory. He was also deeply happy. This is worth noting because it is easy to read the Edison childhood as a story of deprivation and hardship. The poor family, the failed schools, the deaf boy in the cellar, and miss that the boy himself, by every account, was having a genuinely wonderful time. His father said later, with some bewilderment, that Thomas never had any boyhood days, and never shared to any extent the sports of his neighbourhood. But this was Sam Edison's definition of boyhood, not Thomas's. The boy in the cellar, absorbed in his chemicals and his telegraph experiments and his books, was not suffering. He was, by his own account, repeated many times throughout his life, intensely absorbed and intensely content. The deafness complicated this. It arrived around the age of 12, shortly after he began working on the railway. Its precise origin remains uncertain. Edison himself gave conflicting accounts at different points in his life. The most dramatic version, that a conductor boxed his ears after a laboratory fire in the baggage car and the blow caused permanent damage. Edison himself later retracted, saying the conductor had actually been kind to him and that they corresponded on friendly terms afterward. The more likely medical explanation, supported by the pattern of symptoms Edison described, is that the deafness developed gradually from a middle ear infection, possibly related to the scarlet fever he had suffered in early childhood, and that it was worsened at some point by physical trauma to the ear. Whatever its origin, it was real, and it was permanent. By his early teens, he could hear almost nothing in ordinary conversational conditions. He could hear better when the surrounding environment was itself loud. The roar of a moving train, for instance, caused other passengers to raise their voices to a shout, and he could follow them. In quiet rooms, in ordinary conversation, he heard very little. He made light of it, publicly and consistently, for the rest of his life. He said it helped him concentrate. He said it spared him the distraction of small talk. He said, famously, and with characteristic dark humour, that it was an advantage for a telegrapher, since the clicking of the instrument came through clearly, while other distracting sounds did not. There is something real in all of this. But in a private diary he kept briefly in 1885, he wrote 7 words that tell a different story. "I haven't heard a bird sing since I was 12 years old." What the deafness did, practically and demonstrably, was drive him inward and drive him to read, cut off from the casual social intercourse of his peers, unable to participate easily in the ordinary talk of people around him. He retreated to books with a new urgency. He joined the Detroit Free Library. His membership card was numbered 33, and attacked its shelves with a systematic ambition that alarmed even him in retrospect. He read Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. He read Victor Hugo's Les Misérables, the story of outcasts and outsiders, with particular passion, and his companions on the railway sometimes called him Victor Hugo Edison because of how often he talked about it. He attempted Newton's Principia at age 15, got lost in the mathematics, put it down in frustration, and formed what he described as a distaste for mathematics, from which I have never recovered. He read Faraday's accounts of his electrical experiments and found in them something he had been looking for without knowing it, a great scientist who worked entirely from experiment, who distrusted elaborate theoretical frameworks, who believed that nature revealed its laws directly through careful physical observation. The Grand Trunk Railway arrived in Port Huron in 1859, and Thomas Edison was at the station before the tracks were properly finished. He was 12 years old, and he wanted the job of candy butcher, the boy who walked the carriages selling newspapers, sandwiches, apples, peanuts and molasses to passengers on the daily run between Port Huron and Detroit. The position paid no regular wage. What it offered instead was the right to sell things, keep the proceeds, and be present on a moving train for 14 hours a day. His mother strongly objected. His father, whose own finances had continued their long decline, negotiated the arrangement on his son's behalf. The local railroad officials, looking at the small boy with the oversized head and the direct gaze, gave him the job. He left Port Huron at 7 every morning and returned at 9:30 at night. He gave his mother $1 a day from his earnings. What he did with the hours in between is one of the more remarkable stories in the history of American self-invention, and most of it happened not in any school or laboratory, but on a moving train between two Michigan towns. The daily layover in Detroit ran for most of the afternoon. Edison spent part of it working the newspaper stand in the station, part of it in the machine shops around the railway yard, watching men repair valves and steam boilers, asking questions, learning by observation how mechanical systems failed and how they were fixed. He spent another part of it at the Detroit Free Library, which is where the reading described in the previous chapter actually took place, and he spent whatever time remained in a corner of the baggage car that he had arranged with the conductor's permission to use as a rolling laboratory. Shelves had been fitted to the back wall. George Pullman, who was then making some of his first railway carriages in a small Detroit shop, reportedly made up the railed shelving that held the jars and bottles safely against the motion of the train. Edison stocked it with chemicals, wire, batteries and tools. He was 13 years old, and he had, in all probability, the world's first mobile chemical laboratory. The commercial dimension of these years deserves attention, because it shows something about Edison's mind that is sometimes overlooked in the emphasis on his scientific curiosity. He was not only a young experimenter, he was also, from a very early age, a young entrepreneur of considerable ingenuity. He noticed that his newspaper sales spiked dramatically on days when major battles were reported from the Civil War. He began visiting the composing room of the Detroit Free Press before each run to inspect the advance galley proofs for that day's edition, so that he could estimate his supply needs accurately. He negotiated with the newspaper's managing editor directly, but bypassing the distribution staff who had rebuffed him, for bulk consignments on credit. He arranged for the railway's train dispatcher to telegraph brief advance bulletins of major stories to the station agents along his route, so that crowds would already be waiting on the platforms when his train arrived. In April of 1862, when the first reports of the Battle of Shiloh came through, with initial casualty estimates of 60,000 killed and wounded, he put this entire system into operation at once. He bought 1,000 copies of the Detroit Free Press on credit, had a bulletin telegraph to every station on his route, and then repriced his newspapers at each successive stop as the crowds grew larger. At the first station he charged 10 cents, at the next 15. By the time the train reached Port Huron, he was selling papers for 25 cents each, and shouting that he did not have enough to go round. He had paid a few cents apiece for them. He later said, reflecting on that day, that it was the moment he understood what the telegraph was really for, not as a curiosity, not as a technical achievement, but as a lever, a tool that could move information faster than anything else, and that whoever understood it first could use to enormous advantage. He decided that day to become a telegrapher. The man who taught him was J.U. Mackenzie, the station master at Mount Clemens, whose 3-year-old son Edison had pulled off a railway track. Seconds before, a rolling boxcar would have killed him. Mackenzie, in gratitude, offered to teach the boy telegraphy at no charge, putting him up at the family home for several months, while he learned to send and receive. Edison arrived for his first lesson carrying a set of telegraph instruments he had built himself at a gunsmith's shop in Detroit. Mackenzie, who had been expecting a beginner, was not entirely sure what to make of this. By the winter of 1863, Edison had absorbed everything Mackenzie could teach him. He was 16. He was now, in the language of the trade, a plug, a second-class operator capable of finding work almost anywhere, because the demand for telegraphers during the Civil War was insatiable. Both armies used the telegraph extensively. Hundreds of operators had been pulled into military service. The civilian network was chronically understaffed. What followed were 5 years that Edison himself described as his wonder years, a period of nomadic, restless, often impoverished drifting through the telegraph offices of the American interior that would, in retrospect, constitute one of the most unusual educations any inventor ever received. He held, by conservative estimate, at least a dozen positions in roughly 5 years, in towns including Stratford Junction, Adrian, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Nashville, Memphis, and Louisville. He was fired for most of them. The reasons were consistent. He was inattentive to routine duties while his mind was elsewhere. He modified equipment without permission. He neglected outgoing messages for hours at a time while he drew circuit diagrams in his notebook. He played elaborate practical jokes using electrical apparatus of his own construction, including a device in a Cincinnati roundhouse that delivered a powerful shock through a water trough to anyone who dipped their hands in it, which he watched through a hole in the ceiling above with what contemporaries described as enormous satisfaction. At Stratford Junction in Ontario, he was very nearly sent to prison. He had devised a clockwork mechanism that automatically transmitted his on-duty signal at specified hours, freeing him to take cat naps between train movements. The device worked perfectly until the night a train dispatcher's urgent order to hold a freight train arrived while Edison was asleep. The train ran past the signal. A collision with an oncoming train was only narrowly avoided when the two engineers spotted each other's headlights on a straight track and stopped in time. Edison, summoned to the general manager's office in Toronto, was informed that his negligence could result in a criminal charge under Canadian law. He escaped, as he later told it, by slipping out of the office during a distraction and jumping a freight train back to Michigan. Throughout these years, his actual skill as a telegraph operator was formidable. At his best, taking press copy at the rate of 45 words a minute in a clear manuscript, hand that his supervisors found almost impossibly neat, he was considered among the finest operators in the country. When he bothered to apply himself to the routine work, nobody could touch him. The problem was that he rarely bothered for long. The money he earned disappeared almost immediately, not into drink or gambling, which were the vices of most of his telegrapher colleagues, but into books and electrical equipment. A co-worker in Cincinnati named Walter Phillips described seeing Edison arrive after payday, look vaguely around, and then produce from under his arm a Ruhmkorff induction coil that had apparently consumed most of the month's wages. He then asked if anyone could lend him $50 for supper. His living conditions in these years were genuinely squalid. He rented cheap back rooms in boarding houses, filling them floor to ceiling with wire, batteries, chemical bottles, and books. He sometimes had no overcoat in winter. In Memphis, one winter, he reportedly went without one and nearly froze. On one occasion, having been stranded without money after being dismissed in Memphis, he walked more than 100 miles through Tennessee to reach Nashville, arriving in a linen duster in the middle of a snowstorm. He came close, in 1867, to not being part of this story at all. Desperate and restless after a particularly unproductive period in Louisville, he made plans to sail to Brazil with two Southern telegrapher friends who had seen an advertisement from the Brazilian government offering positions to experienced operators. He travelled to New Orleans with them to take passage on a chartered steamer. In New Orleans, a friendly Spaniard with knowledge of South America painted the Amazon region so bleakly, the disease, the isolation, the near certain hardship, that Edison decided to stay. His two companions sailed. Both were dead of yellow fever within weeks of arriving in Veracruz, Mexico. Boston in 1868 was the closest thing America had to a centre of serious electrical engineering, and Edison knew it. The city had fine clockmakers and opticians who had pivoted to making telegraphic instruments by hand. It had the shop of Charles Williams Jr. on Court Street, where skilled artisans produced electrical equipment of a quality unavailable in the Midwest. It had men like J.B. Stearns, who was introducing innovations in telegraphic transmission, and Thomas Hall, who had built a miniature electric motored train back in 1852. It had a culture of applied scientific tinkering that was genuinely without parallel in the United States at that moment. For a young man who had been educating himself in isolation through second-hand books and borrowed equipment in Louisville rooming houses, arriving in Boston was like stepping from a dim room into a well-lit one. The journey there had not been comfortable. A fierce March blizzard halted his train between Toronto and Montreal for 24 hours, stranding passengers in deep snowdrifts until trainmen on snowshoes organised a rescue to a nearby inn. He arrived in Boston 4 days late, went directly to the Western Union office and applied for work. The manager, George Milliken, after a 5-minute interview, hired him on the spot, impressed by a letter written in Edison's extraordinarily neat manuscript hand, and by the assurance that the young man could take press copy at speed for hours without error. He was to start that same afternoon. His colleagues immediately arranged to humiliate him. They assigned the new arrival from Michigan to receive press copy from one of the fastest senders in New York, without mentioning what was coming. Edison recognized the setup from the expressions of barely suppressed excitement on the faces around him and said nothing. He kept pace with the New York sender, occasionally pausing with deliberate calm to sharpen a pencil while the sounder ran on. When the sender began slurring his signals, a professional trick, Edison simply opened his key and sent back a single dry message. "Say, young man, change off and send with the other foot." The joke collapsed. From that evening, the Boston operators treated him differently. He installed himself in a hall bedroom on Exeter Street with his old friend Milton Adams, resuming the singular routine he had followed through the wander years, working at the telegraph sounder at night, staying awake most of the day to read and experiment. He found the old bookshops on Cornhill and began accumulating what his room could barely contain. He visited William's shop and was welcomed by the community of electrical enthusiasts there, who noticed, behind the country clothes and the tobacco-stained fingers, the quality of his mind. Then he found the book that changed the direction of everything. At some point in 1868, he was precise about the effect and vague about the exact timing. He purchased a second-hand copy of Michael Faraday's 2-volume experimental researches in electricity. He began reading it when he returned to his room at 4 a.m. after his telegraph shift. He read through the day without sleeping and went back to work the next evening without having stopped. He told Adams, in the grip of a genuine excitement, that his roommate found both inspiring and slightly alarming. "I am now 21. I may live to be 50. Can I get as much done as he did? I have got so much to do, and life is so short, I am going to hustle." What Faraday gave Edison was not new scientific information. Much of what Faraday had discovered was already familiar to him in outline. What Faraday gave him was a model. Here was a man who had been poor, who had been largely self-taught, who had built his entire understanding of electrical science through direct experiment rather than mathematical abstraction, and who had arrived by that method at some of the most consequential discoveries in the history of physics. Faraday's journals communicated both the process and the excitement of systematic experimental inquiry with a clarity that formal scientific writing rarely achieved. For Edison, reading them was less like receiving instruction than like receiving permission. He threw himself into experimental work at Williams's shop with a new purposefulness. His first serious inventive effort in Boston was a duplex telegraph, a system for sending 2 messages simultaneously over a single wire, which he had been turning over in his mind since Indianapolis. He attracted the interest of several Boston capitalists willing to advance small sums against future profits. He filed his first patent application in October of 1868 for a telegraphic vote recording machine. The vote recorder is worth examining carefully because the story of its failure is one of the most instructive episodes in Edison's entire career. The device was genuinely ingenious. Wires ran from the seat of each member of a legislative chamber to a central receiving instrument. Each member had 2 buttons, one for yes and one for no. When a vote was called, every member pressed their button simultaneously, and the total appeared instantly on a dial beside the speaker's desk. It eliminated the slow, laborious process of calling each member's name and recording their individual response. Edison was certain it would be adopted by Congress, then by every state legislature in the country, and that the resulting fortune would finance everything else he wanted to do. He and his partner travelled to Washington and demonstrated the machine before a congressional committee. The committee chairman listened politely, watched the demonstration, and then said, with the quiet authority of someone explaining an obvious fact to a person who had not yet understood it, "Young man, that is just what we do not want. Your invention would destroy the only hope the minority has of influencing legislation. The moment a majority knows it has the votes to pass a measure, it will do so. The minority's only weapon is delay. Your machine eliminates delay." Edison later said he saw the force of the argument immediately and was as much crushed as it was possible to be at my age. The lesson he drew from this crushing was specific and permanent. He resolved from that day forward that he would never again invest his effort in an invention unless he had first established that a genuine commercial demand for it existed. He would not make things that were technically elegant but economically or politically unwelcome. He would make things that people, or more precisely, that the market, demonstrably needed and would demonstrably pay for. This resolution is sometimes cited as evidence of Edison's essentially mercenary character. That reading is too simple. What Edison was doing was not abandoning idealism for commerce. He was making a practical judgment about the conditions under which an inventor, without inherited wealth or institutional support, could actually sustain himself. The alternative to commercial success was what he had been living for 5 years: chronic poverty, dependence on borrowed equipment, ideas that went nowhere because there was no money to develop them. He had seen what happened to inventors who built things nobody needed. He had read about Charles Goodyear's debtor's prison and John Fitch's madness. He was going to do it differently. He returned to Boston, continued his experiments, and ran out of money. His duplex telegraph trial in Rochester, conducted over the wires of the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company one night in April of 1869, produced no results at all. The assisting telegrapher at the New York end apparently could not follow the instructions Edison had sent him. He gave up after several nights of failed trials, made his way back to Boston with his creditors closing in, borrowed a few dollars from a friend, and bought a boat ticket to New York. He arrived the next morning with not a coin left in his pocket. The story of his first days in New York has the quality of an Horatio Alger novel, which is partly why it needs to be told carefully. He had no friends in the city who could immediately help him. He managed, through charm and nerve, to talk a tea merchant near Washington Market into giving him a sample package of fine tea, which he then exchanged at a downtown restaurant for a meal of apple dumplings and coffee. He later said, with a sentimentality that was unusual for him, that it was the finest meal he had ever eaten. Apple dumplings remained his favourite dish for the rest of his life. He found his way to the offices of the Gold Indicator Company on Broad Street, where an electrical engineer named Franklin Pope allowed him to use the battery room as sleeping quarters while he looked for work. He spent 2 or 3 nights there, 5 cents at a time, subsisting on apple dumplings while millions of dollars changed hands in the trading rooms above his head. Then the Gold Indicator's central transmitter broke down. The machine stopped with a crash during peak trading hours. The brokerage offices, depending on its gold price signals, went dark. 300 messenger boys flooded the streets, trying to restore manual communications between the exchange and the brokers. The company's founder, Dr. S.S. Laws, came rushing from his office in a state of high agitation. The engineer Pope, also present, could find nothing visibly wrong. The din was, by Edison's account, extraordinary. Edison, who had spent 2 days studying the transmitter in detail while sleeping in the room beneath it, quietly examined the mechanism, found a broken contact spring that had lodged between 2 gear wheels, removed it, reset the central dial to 0, and told Laws he believed the machine would now work. Within 18 months of sleeping in that battery room, Edison had $40,000. The money came from General Marshall Lefferts, Eastern Superintendent of Western Union, who had been watching the young inventor's work on stock ticker improvements with increasing interest. When Edison demonstrated a unison stop device that instantly brought all the printing telegraphs in outlying brokerage offices into alignment with the central transmitter, solving one of the most persistent and expensive problems in the entire ticker service. Lefferts invited him to name his price. Edison, uncertain what to ask and afraid of overreaching, told Lefferts to make him an offer. Lefferts said $40,000. Edison, by his own account, came close to fainting. He managed to say the offer seemed fair enough. He had never held a cheque before. When he took it to the bank and the teller spoke to him, his deafness prevented him from understanding that he was being asked for identification. He retreated, bewildered, convinced he had somehow been swindled. He returned to the Western Union office with a long face. His host laughed, explained what had happened, sent a secretary to accompany him back to the bank, and watched him leave with a pile of bills nearly a foot thick stuffed into his clothing. He spent virtually the entire sum within 30 days on machinery. This pattern, large payment received, large payment immediately converted into equipment and materials and labour, would repeat itself throughout Edison's life with a consistency that both astonished and exasperated the people around him. He was not irresponsible with money in the ordinary sense. He did not lose it gambling or spend it on personal luxury. He invested it immediately and completely in the next thing he wanted to build. The concept of financial reserve appears to have struck him as a category error. Money sitting still was money doing nothing, and doing nothing was, for Edison, a condition close to physical pain. In the winter of 1871, he rented the top floor of a building at 4 to 6 Ward Street in Newark, New Jersey, hired mechanics in response to newspaper advertisements, and opened a manufacturing shop to produce stock tickers for Western Union. He was 24 years old. Most of his new employees were older than he was. None of them had seen a shop boss quite like this one. The men Edison hired in Newark formed the core of what would become, over the next decade, one of the most productive small technical teams in American history. Charles Batchelor was a genial, black-bearded Englishman who had come to America to install machinery at a Newark textile mill and stayed when he heard about the new electrical equipment factory. His manual skill was extraordinary. His hands could hold a position of almost inhuman steadiness for hours, and his ability to execute in physical brass and iron the mechanisms that existed only in Edison's mind was without equal on the staff. He became Edison's primary hands for the next decade, the man who built what Edison imagined. John Crucy was a Swiss clockmaker who had undergone a rigorous European apprenticeship and could construct almost any instrument or machine set before him. John Ott was a young machinist whose first interview consisted of Edison pointing to a pile of disassembled stock printer parts on the floor and saying, "Can you make this machine go?" Ott said he would work for nothing if he failed. When he succeeded, Edison said on the spot, "Here, you come and take charge of this place." Sigmund Bergmann was a German mechanic who could barely speak English when he arrived, which Edison dismissed entirely. What difference does it make? His work speaks for him. These men would follow Edison to Menlo Park, to West Orange, and through 20 years of some of the most consequential inventive work of the 19th century. They were not merely assistants. They were skilled, dedicated, and in their specific domains, genuinely brilliant. The ethical question of credit and compensation, how much of what bore Edison's name was actually theirs, is real, and will be examined honestly when the specific inventions are discussed. For now, it is enough to establish that Edison built his working life around a principle he never fully articulated, but always practiced. Surround yourself with people who are better than you at the specific things you cannot do yourself, and then direct them toward problems only you can define. The Newark years, from 1871 to 1876, were years of intense commercial productivity. Edison filed patents at a rate that startled even Western Union, which had hired him. Improvements to stock printers, telegraph repeaters, automatic telegraph systems, printing instruments of various kinds, a torrent of incremental but commercially significant innovations that established his reputation among the tight community of men who controlled the electrical communications industry. They were also years shadowed by the more troubling aspects of how that industry actually worked. The quadruplex telegraph, Edison's masterwork of this period, a system for sending 4 messages simultaneously over a single wire, doubling the capacity of the existing Stearns duplex, brought him directly into the orbit of Jay Gould, and the encounter was clarifying in ways that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Edison had spent 3 years developing the quadruplex for Western Union. The company's president, William Orton, delayed finalizing payment, while Edison grew increasingly desperate for cash to meet his manufacturing costs. In late 1874, with Orton away in Chicago and creditors pressing hard, General Eckert, Western Union's superintendent, and a man with grievances of his own against Orton, appeared at Edison's Newark shop one evening, accompanied by a small dark-eyed man, whose coat collar was turned up to conceal his face. It was Jay Gould. Edison demonstrated the quadruplex. Gould offered $30,000 for Edison's rights in the invention. Edison accepted. The check cleared the next morning. Within days, Gould had used the patent to launch a legal war against Western Union that would drag through the courts for 7 years. What happened next is instructive about both men. Gould had promised Edison a position as chief electrician of his combined telegraph companies, stock worth $250,000 and royalties. He delivered none of it. When the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company was merged into Gould's empire, the stockholders who had been promised an exchange of shares received essentially nothing. Edison was among them. He wrote Gould a letter of protest, passionate, detailed, describing years of effort and disappointment, and received no reply. Years later, asked about Gould, Edison was remarkably measured. He observed that Gould collected information voraciously before any undertaking, that he was genuinely a hard worker, and that his conscience seemed to be atrophied. He added, with the dry detachment that was one of his most characteristic tones, "I held no grudge against him because he was so able in his line." This response is not naivety. It is something more interesting. A man who had decided, perhaps after the vote recorder and certainly after Gould, that the emotional energy required to maintain resentment was energy unavailable for work, and that work was the only thing that actually mattered. Whether this was wisdom or a kind of emotional self-protection is a question worth leaving open. By the end of 1875, Edison had resolved to leave Newark entirely. The combined demands of manufacturing and inventing had become irreconcilable. Every time an interesting idea struck him, the factory schedule made it impossible to pursue. Every time he disappeared into an experimental problem, the factory fell behind on its orders. He wanted a place of his own, purpose-built for a single activity, invention. He asked his father, old Sam Edison, the tower builder, the shingle miller, the inveterate schemer, to look for a suitable site somewhere in the New Jersey countryside, within reasonable distance of New York. Sam Edison found a small, almost empty hamlet called Menlo Park, about 25 miles southwest of the city, sitting on a hill beside the Pennsylvania railway line. In the spring of 1876, construction began on a plain wooden building 100 feet long by 30 feet wide, that looked, as more than one visitor observed, exactly like a country tabernacle or meeting house. The white painted clapboard structure that rose on that New Jersey hilltop was, in fact, something the world had never seen before. A private laboratory designed and staffed and equipped specifically to produce inventions on a systematic basis, not a university laboratory oriented toward knowledge, not a factory oriented toward production. Something new, a hybrid, an institution whose entire purpose was the organized, sustained, well-resourced creation of practical new things. When the building was finished, Edison moved in with Batchelor, Crucy, Ott, and a dozen other mechanics. He told the staff that their business was invention, and that when they had finished inventing one thing, they would invent more things. He promised Dr. George Beard, a physician acquaintance who expressed polite skepticism, that he intended to produce a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. Beard thought this was boasting. Looking at Edison's recent patent rate, roughly 40 a year, he revised his opinion. The accident began with a needle pricking his finger. Edison had been working through the summer of 1877 on improvements to Alexander Graham Bell's telephone transmitter, a commission from Western Union that required him to study, in close physical detail, how a vibrating diaphragm responded to sound, because his hearing was too poor to judge results by ear alone. He developed a habit of testing diaphragm vibrations by touching a short needle attached to the centre of the disc and speaking into it. The needle moved with the sound waves. On one occasion, it pricked his finger hard enough to draw blood. He noted the force of it with interest. He had been thinking simultaneously about telegraph repeater devices, machines that could record incoming Morse signals on paper tape and play them back at a controlled speed. In June of 1877, his notebooks record an experiment in which he ran a strip of paraffin paper beneath a diaphragm with a small blunt pin attached. When the device raced along at speed, the indentations of dots and dashes sometimes produced, against the pin of a second diaphragm, a faint rhythmic sound that he described as resembling human talk heard indistinctly. These two threads, the vibrating telephone diaphragm and the indented paper tape, converged in his mind sometime in mid-July. His notebook entry for July 18th reads with the controlled excitement of a man who has just seen something clearly. Just tried experiment with a diaphragm having an embossing point and held against paraffin paper moving rapidly. The speaking vibrations are indented nicely, and there is no doubt that I shall be able to store up and reproduce automatically at any future time the human voice perfectly. He was not yet building a talking machine. He was designing a telephone repeater, a device for recording incoming calls and playing them back. The commercial application he had in mind was office dictation. It did not occur to him at this stage that what he was describing was something categorically new in human history. He approached it as an engineering problem of moderate difficulty, assigned it a preliminary sketch, and wrote a piecework price of $18 on the paper. The mechanic who received that sketch was John Crucy. Crucy built it. When he finished, he asked Edison what it was for. Edison told him it was a machine that would record and reproduce the human voice. Crucy scratched his head. Several of the other men present bet Edison's cigars that it would not work. The device was a brass cylinder mounted on a foot-long shaft with a hand crank, 2 diaphragm tubes mounted at opposite sides, and a sheet of tin foil wrapped around the cylinder. Edison fixed the foil in place, began turning the crank, leaned toward one of the diaphragm tubes, and recited, "Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go." He moved the first diaphragm away, repositioned the second one for reproduction, and turned the crank again from the starting point. Out of the machine came his own voice, reciting the nursery rhyme. Crucy went pale and made a pious exclamation in German. The men who had bet cigars stood very still. Edison himself later said he was never so taken aback in all my life, and that he was always afraid of things that worked the first time. They sat up through the rest of the night adjusting and testing it, talking into it and singing into it, and listening with an astonishment that did not diminish with repetition. What they were feeling was the specific vertigo of people present at a genuinely unprecedented event, not an improvement on something that existed, but the arrival of something that had not existed before. On December 7th, 1877, Edison and Batchelor took the machine to the offices of the Scientific American in New York. Edison announced to the editor that he had a device that would record and reproduce the human voice. He set it up, demonstrated it, and watched the crowd that gathered grow so rapidly that the editor became genuinely alarmed the floor would give way. The following morning, the newspapers carried columns about it. The patent was filed on December 15th. Nothing remotely like it appeared anywhere in the Patent Office's prior records. The grant arrived in 57 days. What followed was the first of Edison's two great experiences of sudden, overwhelming public fame. Newspaper reporters flooded Menlo Park. Illustrated magazines published full-page engravings of the speaking phonograph. A leading American journal called him conceivably the greatest inventor of the age, and added with a swipe at the theoretical scientists of the day, while Huxley, Tyndall, Spencer and other theorists talk and speculate, he produces accomplished facts. He was invited to Washington, demonstrated the phonograph before Congress and before President Rutherford Hayes at the White House. The demonstration ran until 3:30 in the morning because Hayes kept asking for more. He showed it to Joseph Henry at the Smithsonian, the aging physicist who had done more than any other American to lay the scientific foundations of electrical science, and who received it with quiet reverence. Bishop John Vincent, co-founder of the Chautauqua Association, arrived at Menlo Park convinced there was a ventriloquist hidden somewhere in the apparatus. To satisfy himself, he shouted into the recording tube a rapid string of obscure Old Testament names, chosen specifically because he believed no ventriloquist could reproduce them quickly enough to fool him. The machine reproduced them. The bishop announced himself satisfied that no fraud was being committed. Edison enjoyed all of this. He was 31 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in poverty or near it, and the world had suddenly decided he was a wizard. He gave demonstrations, answered questions, showed crowds how the machine worked, and explained its mechanisms with what observers described as a plain, homely, genuinely unpretentious clarity that charmed people who had expected either arrogance or mystification. On the 8th of September 1878, Edison visited the brass manufacturing shops of William Wallace in Ansonia, Connecticut, and saw 8 arc lights burning at 500 candle power each, powered by a Wallace Farmer dynamo of 8 horsepower. He did not stand back and admire them. He ran between the lights and the dynamo, sprawled across a table making calculations, scribbled numbers covering power consumption, coal costs, transmission losses and probable manufacturing expense. He calculated how many lights a single dynamo could drive, what each one cost per hour to run, and what a network of such lights across a city would require in copper wire and generating capacity. Then he stood up, turned to Wallace, and said with the flat confidence of someone stating an observable fact, rather than making a boast, "I believe I can beat you making the electric light. I do not think you are working in the right direction." They shook hands. Edison signed his name on a wine goblet with a diamond-pointed stylus and dated it. He was already somewhere else in his mind before he left the building. What he had seen at Wallace's was not a solution. It was the shape of the problem. Arc lights worked by passing a strong current across a gap between 2 carbon rods, producing a brilliant blue-white flame. They were intensely bright, far too bright for a domestic room, and they burned in open globes that emitted heat and noxious gases. They were wired in series, meaning all lamps on a circuit had to be turned on or off together, like beads on a string, if one failed or went dark, and they consumed enormous quantities of current, requiring thick, expensive copper conductors that made the cost of distributing them across a city prohibitive at any meaningful scale. What the gaslight industry provided, and what Edison understood with the clarity of someone who had just spent 2 weeks studying it in encyclopedic detail, was something entirely different. Individual jets, each one independently controllable, mild, domestic, safe, distributed through a network of mains and branch pipes, from a central source to thousands of individual consumers, each paying for exactly what they used. A system, in other words, not just a light. His insight, which ran directly against the prevailing engineering consensus, was that the correct approach was not to make arc lights smaller and more manageable, but to invent an entirely different kind of light, one of high electrical resistance, consuming very little current, enclosed in a sealed glass globe from which the air had been exhausted, and designed from the outset to function within a parallel circuit where each lamp could be controlled independently of every other. Every qualified electrical engineer in England and America who heard this plan declared it impossible. Lord Kelvin said so. Professor Sylvanus Thompson published a formal paper arguing that anyone attempting the subdivision of electric current into many small lights was doomed to failure. A parliamentary committee, after consulting Britain's leading scientists, ruled that Edison's plans were good enough for our transatlantic friends, but unworthy of the attention of practical or scientific men. The gaslight securities that had fallen on news of Edison's entrance into the field quietly began to recover. Edison responded to this professional consensus by calling in the newspaper reporters. In a series of interviews published through September and October of 1878 in the New York Sun, the New York Herald, and the New York Tribune, he announced that he had already discovered the secret of electric light subdivision, that he expected to have a working system ready in 6 weeks, and that he intended to illuminate the entire downtown district of New York with 500,000 lamps powered by a few central steam dynamos. The gaslight stocks collapsed again. Edison Electric Light Company stock, though barely organised and holding no working invention, rose to $600 a share on the strength of his words alone. He had, at the time of these announcements, a platinum wire burner that could sustain incandescence for approximately 10 minutes before melting. This behaviour, the premature, deliberately sensational public announcement made before the technical substance existed to support it, is one of the most consistently misread aspects of Edison's method. It was not simply showmanship, though it was also that. It was a calculated financial strategy, executed with the advice of his patent lawyer Grosvenor Lowry, designed to attract the investment capital, without which no further work was possible. The announcements created urgency in the financial community. The urgency brought money. The money bought time and equipment and staff. By October of 1878, Lowry had assembled a syndicate that included Hamilton Twombly, son-in-law of William Vanderbilt, and Egisto Fabry, a partner of J. Pierpont Morgan. The Edison Electric Light Company was incorporated with 3,000 shares, of which Edison received 2,500 in exchange for assigning all his electric lighting patents to the company for 5 years. The syndicate's cash members paid $50,000 between them for the remaining 500 shares. Edison received the first instalment of $30,000 in cash. He also received, for the first time in his career, a genuine institutional patron with deep pockets and a long investment horizon. Morgan was not yet the dominant figure he would become in the 1890s, but he was already careful, powerful, and strategic. He understood that he was not buying an invention. He was buying the right to own an invention once it existed. The distinction mattered to him, and he watched the progress of Menlo Park accordingly, through Fabry as his representative on the board, through Lowry as his intermediary, and through the occasional personal visit when the situation seemed to warrant it. Francis Upton arrived at Menlo Park in December of 1878, engaged at Lowry's recommendation. He was a tall, precise, black-bearded young man who had studied at Princeton and spent a year in Germany under Helmholtz. Edison immediately nicknamed him Culture and began testing him with practical problems designed to expose the gap between theoretical training and direct physical intuition. The story of the glass bulb. Upton reaching for calculus to compute its volume, while Edison simply filled it with water and poured the water into a measuring cylinder, made the rounds of the laboratory and established, with good humour and without rancour, the working relationship between the two men. Upton would calculate. Edison would imagine. Neither could do the other's job. Platinum came first, and platinum failed. Through the winter and spring of 1879, Edison and his staff tested platinum wire burners inside partially evacuated glass globes, with a thermostatic regulator designed to prevent the metal from reaching its melting point. The lamps blinked rather than burned steadily. They lasted minutes, not hours. The platinum was expensive, the supply limited, and the fundamental problem intractable. The metal simply could not sustain the temperatures required for useful light without eventually fusing. In April, Edison demonstrated his best platinum lamp to the Morgan and Vanderbilt group at Menlo Park. The lamps glowed a dull cherry red, briefly and unreliably, then failed. One of the directors, Robert Cutting, remarked coolly that he had read about a similar lamp demonstrated by an American inventor named Starr 30 years earlier, and wondered aloud whether the $50,000 invested so far had produced anything beyond the same stopping point. The delegation returned to New York on the evening train in poor spirits. Edison walked the laboratory afterward, with his hands in his pockets and his head down. The notebooks show him changing course within days. Platinum was stored away. The search broadened. Over the following months, Edison directed his staff through what he later described as testing approximately 1,600 different materials for their potential as incandescent filaments. The number has sometimes been treated as an exaggeration or a publicity claim. The laboratory notebooks, which survive in their original form, support it. The range of materials tested reads like an inventory of a natural history museum. Bark, bagging, cane fibre, cardboard, cork, cedar shavings, celluloid, fishing line, flax, hair from the beards of several staff members, hooves, horsehide, cork, various grasses, plumbago, punk, twine, and dozens of specific wood samples. Each was carbonized in a sealed crucible, formed into a filament, mounted in a glass globe, pumped to whatever vacuum the current equipment could achieve, and tested under current. None of them were adequate, but the failures were not uniform failures. Each one told Edison something about the behaviour of carbon under extreme heat in near vacuum conditions, and those incremental observations were gradually converging on a clearer picture of what the successful material would need to be. Two parallel technical advances made the eventual breakthrough possible. The first was the vacuum. Edison had learned of Sir William Crookes's work with the Sprengel pump in England and obtained one of the first such instruments to reach America, borrowing it temporarily from Princeton University and sending Upton by train and buggy to collect it. With the Sprengel pump, the laboratory could achieve vacuums of 1/100,000th of an atmosphere, and eventually, after further refinement, 1/1,000,000th. At that level of exhaustion, carbon filaments that had previously oxidized and failed within seconds could be sustained at incandescence for measurably longer periods. The second advance was the discovery of occluded gases. Edison observed that metallic and carbon materials contained gases absorbed within their structure that were released under high heat, disrupting the vacuum inside the globe and accelerating the filament's destruction. He devised a method of expelling these gases before sealing the lamp. The filament was brought to incandescence inside the globe while the pump was still running, driving out the trapped gases before the seal was made. The resulting filament became noticeably harder and more resistant to high temperatures. He later considered this one of the genuinely original observations of the entire investigation. By late summer of 1879, with a reliable high vacuum and a method for preparing cleaner carbon materials, the shape of the solution was becoming visible. Upton's calculations had long since established that the filament needed to be extremely thin, no more than 1/64 of an inch in diameter, and formed from a material with a fibrous, homogeneous cellular structure that would carbonize evenly and hold its form under stress. On an evening in early October, Edison picked up a bamboo fan lying on his laboratory table and cut away a strip of its binding rim. He examined it under the microscope. The fibrous structure was interesting. He had Batchelor carbonize a sample immediately and mount it for testing. The results were better than anything tested in months, but bamboo came later. What came first in the final critical weeks of October was something simpler and more improbable: a spool of ordinary cotton sewing thread. Edison cut a short length, packed it in powdered carbon inside a sealed earthenware crucible, and heated it at high temperature until the organic material was reduced to a precise carbon structure. The resulting filament, a horseshoe-shaped thread of carbonized cotton, approximately 1/64 of an inch in diameter, was then mounted between platinum lead-in wires inside a glass globe, and the assembly taken to the glass blower's bench to be sealed and evacuated. Batchelor carried the filament. Edison walked behind him. Partway across the laboratory, the filament broke. They turned back and made another one. A jeweler's screwdriver, falling against the second filament, broke that one too. They made a third. By the time it was sealed inside its globe and the pump had run long enough to achieve the required vacuum, the afternoon had become evening. The notebook entry for October 21st, 1879, reads without ceremony: Number 9 ordinary thread, Coates Company cord number 29, came up to 1/2 candle and was put on 18 cells battery permanently at 1:30 a.m. The lamp burned through the night. It was still burning the following morning. It burned for 13.5 hours before the glass cracked, and it failed. A lamp that burned for 13 hours was not, by itself, a revolution. Edison understood this more clearly than almost anyone watching from the outside. What he had produced on October 21st, 1879, was a proof of principle, a demonstration that the thing was physically possible. Between that demonstration and the moment when an ordinary person in an ordinary building, in an ordinary city, could turn a switch and have light, there lay an engineering campaign of staggering complexity that had no precedent anywhere in the world. Every component of the system he had in mind, the dynamos, the underground conductors, the junction boxes, the meters, the sockets, the safety fuses, the switches, had to be invented, tested, manufactured, and installed. None of it existed. None of it had ever existed. He moved to New York in February of 1881, installed his family in a hotel near Gramercy Park, and took over a 4-story mansion at 65 Fifth Avenue as his headquarters and showroom. He hung incandescent lamps from every chandelier in the building and kept them burning late into the night so that people standing on the pavement outside could see what was coming. Then he went to work. The engineering problems he faced were not simply technical. They were economic in a fundamental way that shaped every decision. His feeder and main distribution system, devised in the summer of 1880, solved at a stroke the problem that had caused every qualified engineer in England and America to declare his entire project impossible. By running heavy copper feeder cables from the central station to multiple distribution points, then branching lighter mains from those points to individual consumers, he reduced the total copper required for his network to approximately 1/8 of what a simple parallel circuit would have demanded. Lord Kelvin, witnessing a demonstration of this system in England, was asked why no one had thought of it before. He reportedly replied that the only answer he could find was that no one else was Edison. 2 years later, in 1882, he added the 3-wire distribution system, a further refinement that cut copper requirements by an additional 62.5%, while providing perfect independent control of every lamp on the circuit. These two inventions were, in purely commercial terms, arguably more consequential than the lamp itself. Without them, the economics of electric light distribution would never have competed with gas. The physical installation work in Lower Manhattan was brutal. Edison selected a district running from Wall Street north to Spruce and Ferry Streets, and from the East River west to Nassau Street, roughly a quarter of a square mile in the heart of the financial district. At the centre of this territory, on Pearl Street, he purchased 2 dilapidated buildings for a combined cost of $155,000 and began converting them into the world's first central electric power station. Trenches had to be dug through some of the most congested streets in America, in all weather, through frozen ground in winter, and through the perpetual disruption of a city that never stopped moving. 14 miles of underground conduits were laid, each section of iron pipe 20 feet long, packed with an insulating compound of hot asphaltum that was pumped in and allowed to harden. The insulation leaked constantly in the early months. Current bled into the wet earth and caused strange effects at the surface. Horses shied and reared on certain sections of pavement, their iron shoes completing circuits through the cobblestones. Edison and Crusoe attended personally to the installation of every junction box and coupling, working through nights and sleeping in the cellar of the unfinished station when the hour grew too late to return to Fifth Avenue. 2 of the men who slept in that cold, damp cellar through the winter of 1881 to 1882 became sick and died. Edison himself, who slept there too, was apparently unaffected. The Tammany Hall political machine presented its own category of obstacle. A commissioner of public works informed Edison, with the breezy confidence of a man accustomed to this kind of conversation, that city regulations required 5 inspectors to oversee the conduit laying work at $5 a day each, payable weekly. Edison agreed. He never saw an inspector. He paid the money. Inside the Pearl Street station, 6 Porter Allen steam engines of 240 horsepower each were installed on the second floor, directly connected to 6 jumbo dynamos, each unit weighing 27 tons, capable of powering 1,200 lamps. The name came from P.T. Barnum's famous circus elephant, and it was apt. These were the largest electrical generating machines yet built. Edison had designed them himself with Upton's mathematical assistance, on the principle that the internal resistance of the dynamo must be kept as low as possible, while the external circuit resistance was kept high, the reverse of what most electrical engineers of the era believed was correct. The resulting machines converted mechanical energy into electrical current at an efficiency of approximately 90%. When Edison announced this figure, Edward Weston, a respected Newark inventor and dynamo manufacturer, publicly accused him of claiming something close to a perpetual motion machine. The trial run of the first jumbo on a Sunday in July of 1882 produced what Edison described as the worst circus since Adam was born. When a second dynamo was thrown into parallel operation with the first, the 2 machines began fighting each other, one accelerating while the other braked, seesawing back and forth in an escalating mechanical argument that sent every person in the dynamo room running for cover. Edison grabbed the throttle of one engine. Edward Johnson, the only other person present who kept his nerve, grabbed the other. They shut both machines down. The iron structure carrying the generating units was vibrating so badly that Joel, watching from the doorway, said the whole building felt as if it might walk off its foundations. The problem was the steam engine governors, which could not synchronize adequately. Edison appealed to an engine designer named Gardner Sims for a new type with a centrifugal mechanical governor unaffected by torsional vibration. Sims eventually produced the Armington-Sims engines that solved the problem, but it took additional weeks of modification and testing before the station could run reliably on multiple units. On Monday, the 4th of September, 1882, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Edison gave the order to John Lieb, the station's chief electrician, to close the switch. The current flowed through 14 miles of underground conductor into the buildings of Lower Manhattan. The lamps in the offices of Drexel, Morgan and Company on Broad Street came on, 106 of them. The composing rooms and editorial offices of the New York Times, already wired with 52 lamps, filled with what the paper's own correspondent described as soft, mellow, grateful light. Edison himself appeared at the Morgan offices to turn the lights on personally dressed, depending on which newspaper account you trust, either in a spotless Prince Albert coat and white cravat, or in his usual grimy working clothes with no collar at all. Both accounts were probably accurate at different moments of the same afternoon. He did not make a speech. He did not hold a press conference. Almost immediately after throwing the switch at the Morgan offices, he was back out in the street, hatless, coat off, down in a junction box at the corner of Ann and Nassau Streets, where a current leak had caused a horse to rear straight up on its hind legs, scattering a crowd of onlookers in every direction. He fixed the leak. He moved on to the next problem. The Pearl Street station opened for business with 85 customers and 400 lamps. Within 14 months, it had 508 customers and 12,732 lamps. Within 2 years, the cost of producing each lamp had fallen from $1.21 to 30 cents. The system Edison had promised, the replacement of gas light by electric light, distributed from a central source through an underground network to thousands of individual consumers, each independently controlled and metered, was working in the real world in the most financially consequential neighborhood in America. 3 men shaped the Edison enterprise from the inside, in ways the public story rarely acknowledges. Understanding them properly changes the picture, not by diminishing Edison, but by making the picture more accurate and therefore more interesting. Start with Morgan. John Pierpont Morgan was not, in 1878, the dominant figure he would become. He was 41 years old, a partner in Drexel, Morgan and Company, already powerful in railroad finance and government bond dealings, but not yet the singular force who would reorganize American industry at the turn of the century. His connection to the Edison enterprise came through Grosvenor Lowry, who was both his personal attorney and Edison's advocate, and through the simple financial logic that a patent monopoly over the future of domestic lighting, if it worked, would be one of the most valuable assets in American commerce. Morgan's role in the Edison story is usually described in one of 2 ways. The legend presents him as an enlightened patron, a visionary capitalist who recognized genius and backed it. The revisionist version presents him as a predator who waited for Edison to do the difficult work and then took the industry away from him. Both versions contain real elements. Neither is the whole picture. What the evidence shows is something more transactional than either portrait suggests. Morgan invested in Edison's patents because Lowry convinced him the risk was manageable and the potential return exceptional. He ordered an isolated lighting plant for his own Madison Avenue home, partly out of genuine enthusiasm and partly because owning one gave him direct knowledge of the technology's reliability. When the plant caused a small fire that damaged his library walls and carpets, he had it repaired and kept running. When the noise of the steam engine in his garden kept his neighbours awake and they threatened legal action, he ignored them. He was not easily rattled and he was not sentimental. The key to understanding Morgan's relationship with Edison is the distinction between what each man thought the enterprise was for. Edison thought it was for building an electrical system. Morgan thought it was for building a business. These objectives overlapped substantially in the early years and diverged increasingly as the industry matured. By the time the Edison General Electric Company was formed in 1889 and the subsequent merger with Thomson-Houston produced the General Electric Company in 1892, Morgan's objective, consolidation, elimination of competition, control of patents, and manufacturing under unified financial management, had completely superseded Edison's. Edison's name was removed from the company title in 1892 without his meaningful consent. His secretary, Alfred Tate, who was present when Edison learned of it from a newspaper rather than from his own board, wrote afterward, "Something had died in Edison's heart." That observation is worth taking seriously. Edison was not a man given to self-pity or public grievance. That his secretary felt moved to write those words in those terms, and that the historical record supports them, tells us something real about the cost of the Morgan relationship. Now turn to Charles Batchelor. Batchelor arrived at Edison's Newark shop in 1871 as a 26-year-old English mechanic, recommended by the Clark Sewing Thread Mills, where he had been installing machinery. He stayed for the next 23 years. He was present at the invention of the phonograph, the carbon filament lamp, the carbon telephone transmitter, and dozens of subsidiary devices. He supervised the Edison exhibits at the Paris Electrical Exposition of 1881. He managed Edison's European operations through much of the 1880s. He was, by virtually every account of the period, the most technically indispensable member of Edison's inner circle. His specific contribution is difficult to overstate. Where Edison imagined mechanisms and sketched them in rapid, abbreviated form, Batchelor built them with a manual precision and a sustained physical patience that Edison himself explicitly acknowledged he did not possess. When the carbonized cotton thread filament of October 21st, 1879, had to be carried across the laboratory to the glass blower's bench without breaking, it was Batchelor who carried it. Edison walked behind him. When the first phonograph was adjusted and refined through the night of its invention, it was Batchelor's hands doing most of the adjusting. His laboratory notebooks survive alongside Edison's and tell a story of parallel, intertwined work that the patent records do not fully reflect. Batchelor received fractional shares in several of the Edison companies. He came out of the 1889 consolidation with approximately $1 million, a substantial sum, and by the standards of his time and station, he was reasonably compensated. Whether that compensation was proportionate to his contribution is a different question, and one that the surviving evidence does not permit a simple answer to. What can be said with confidence is that the version of Edison as lone inventor, working in inspired isolation, is not supported by anything Batchelor wrote or said or did across 2 decades of documented collaboration. Samuel Insull occupies a different category from either Morgan or Batchelor. He was not a financier or a technical collaborator. He was, when he arrived from England in March of 1881 at the age of 21, a clerk. What he became within months was the operational centre of the entire Edison enterprise. Insull opened Edison's mail. He answered it, signing either Edison's name with his initials or his own name, according to his judgment of what the situation required. He held Edison's power of attorney and signed his cheques. He negotiated credit for machinery purchases, managed payrolls for thousands of workers, and tracked the financial position of half a dozen interlocking companies simultaneously. He worked the hours Edison worked, which meant he essentially never stopped. His description of Edison's business method is worth quoting in its full strangeness. Edison would make his own notes on letters, and I would be expected to clean up the correspondence with Edison's laconic notes as guide. It was a very common thing for Edison to write the word yes or no, and this would be all I would have. What Incel provided was the administrative infrastructure without which Edison's creative output would have generated wealth for other people rather than for himself. The irony is that Incel went on, after leaving Edison's service in 1892, to run a Chicago electric utility to build one of the largest corporate empires in American history, and then to lose it entirely in the crash of 1929, in circumstances that ended with his fleeing the country to avoid criminal prosecution and being extradited back to stand trial. He was acquitted. He died in a Paris subway station in 1938, with less than $2,000 to his name. The arc of Incel's life after Edison is its own extraordinary story. What matters here is what it tells us about the Edison operation, that the practical genius of the Menlo Park and West Orange years was not purely Edison's, that it depended on a specific ecosystem of complementary talents, and that the story of invention as a solitary act of individual genius is, in Edison's case, as in most others, a significant simplification of a more complicated and more interesting reality. The Tesla story, as it currently circulates, goes something like this. A brilliant young Serbian inventor arrived in America in 1884 carrying a letter of introduction to Edison. Edison recognized his genius, exploited his labor, promised him $50,000 for improving the company's dynamos, and when Tesla completed the work, laughed at him and said the offer had been a joke. Tesla resigned in fury, was reduced to digging ditches, eventually sold his alternating current patents to Westinghouse, and after Edison spent years trying to destroy him in the War of Currents, died alone and penniless in a New York hotel room, while Edison lived in comfort and died celebrated. Some of this is true, some of it is false. Some of it is true in its details and misleading in its framing. Separating these categories carefully matters, because the popular version has become so fixed that it now functions as a kind of moral allegory, Edison as corporate villain, Tesla as martyred saint, that tells us less about either man than it does about our contemporary appetite for stories with clear heroes and clear villains. Begin with what is documented. Nikola Tesla was born in Serbia in 1856, educated in Austria and Prague, and came to Edison's enterprise not directly from Europe, but through the Paris operations of the Edison Company, where he had been working since 1882 under Charles Batchelor. Batchelor's letter of introduction, which Tesla carried to New York in 1884, contained a line that has been widely quoted. "I know two great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." This letter exists. Its language is confirmed. Tesla was 27 when he arrived at Edison's Manhattan office on Lower Fifth Avenue. Edison was 37. By this point, Edison was no longer spending his days at a laboratory bench. He was managing a sprawling commercial enterprise, dealing with patent litigation, navigating corporate politics, and supervising manufacturing operations that employed thousands of people. The intimate, all-hands collaborative atmosphere of early Menlo Park had given way to something considerably more bureaucratic. What Tesla actually did at Edison's organization is less dramatic than the legend suggests. He worked primarily on improving arc lighting systems and on redesigning certain dynamo components. He was skilled, he was fast, and his colleagues noticed his ability. Edison noticed it too. His later comments about Tesla, though sometimes dismissive, always acknowledged the younger man's technical gifts. The $50,000 dispute is the central contested claim, and it deserves direct examination. Tesla's account, given in his autobiography, written decades after the events, states that Edison offered him $50,000 to redesign the company's dynamo systems, that Tesla completed the redesign successfully over approximately a year, and that when he asked for the money, Edison told him he had been joking, and that Tesla did not understand American humour. Tesla then resigned. Edison's version, and the version supported by the company's financial records of the period, is that no such offer was ever made or documented. The records showed Tesla receiving standard wages throughout his employment. There is no contract, no memorandum, no contemporaneous letter, and no corroborating witness to the $50,000 offer. This does not necessarily mean Tesla fabricated the story. Memory is genuinely unreliable over decades, and it is possible that an informal conversation about potential bonuses was understood differently by each party. What the evidence does not support is the version in which Edison made a clear, formal, documented promise and then cynically reneged on it. The evidence for that specific narrative is Tesla's recollection, written many years later against a documentary record that shows no such agreement. What is not in dispute is that Tesla left Edison's employment in 1885, that the parting was acrimonious, and that the two men never worked together again. What followed for Tesla was genuinely difficult. He was involved briefly with a company formed to exploit his arc lighting patents, was pushed out of it by his financial backers, and did spend a period doing manual labour, including, by his own account, ditch digging, before finding new investors willing to back his work on alternating current motors. By 1888, he had developed his polyphase AC system and sold the patents to George Westinghouse for a sum variously reported, but certainly substantial. From that point, his financial situation improved dramatically. The incompatibility between Edison and Tesla was real, and it was not primarily about money or credit. It was intellectual and temperamental, and it went deep. Tesla was a theoretician. He worked from mathematical principles, visualized complete mechanisms in his mind before building them, and had genuine contempt for what he called Edison's method of empirical dragnet, testing thousands of possibilities without theoretical guidance. His famous observation about Edison and the needle in the haystack was not made in anger, but in what reads, in context, as genuine bewilderment. I was a sorry witness of such doings, knowing that a little theory and calculation would have saved him 90% of his labour. Edison's response to this kind of criticism was consistent throughout his life. He believed that theory without experiment was fantasy, that the gap between a mathematical prediction and a working physical mechanism was always larger than theoreticians acknowledged, and that the only way to know what something actually did was to build it and observe it. He was not wrong about this as a general principle. He was wrong, specifically and consequentially, in his refusal to engage seriously with the mathematical framework of alternating current, a refusal that had less to do with intellectual limitation than with financial interest and personal stubbornness. The deeper irony in the Edison-Tesla story is that Edison's own laboratory had, in 1883, discovered something that would eventually become one of the foundational elements of electronic science. While testing a modified incandescent lamp, Edison noticed that current appeared to flow from the hot filament across the vacuum inside the globe to a separate metal plate inserted into the bulb, even though there was no physical connection between them. He documented this, filed a patent on the observation, and then set it aside as an interesting anomaly without commercial application. He called it the Edison effect. 20 years later, the British physicist John Ambrose Fleming recognised that what Edison had observed was thermionic emission, the flow of electrons through a vacuum, and used it to develop the first vacuum tube diode the Fleming valve, which became one of the foundational elements of radio technology. Lee de Forest extended it further into the triode, the amplifying tube that made modern radio and electronics possible. The entire lineage of electronic communication, radio, television, radar, and eventually the transistor and the microcomputer, traces back, in a direct and documented line, to the anomaly Edison noticed in 1883 and filed away. He never pursued it. He lacked, by his own admission, the mathematical framework to understand what he had found. Tesla, ironically, also failed to anticipate the significance of electromagnetic waves for wireless communication, a miss that Marconi and Hertz would later exploit. By 1887, the electrical industry Edison had built was under serious competitive pressure, and he knew it. George Westinghouse had entered the incandescent lighting field in 1885 with a directness that Edison found both infuriating and, on some level, almost admirable. A Westinghouse advertisement of that period stated with remarkable candour that the company had profited by the public experience of others and entered the field hampered by a minimum of expense for experimental outlay. Edison called this a plain steel. He was not wrong. Westinghouse was manufacturing incandescent lamps that were, in principle, identical to Edison's, under the cover of patents whose validity was being contested in court. But the patent dispute, though bitter and expensive, was not what made the war of currents consequential. What made it consequential was the underlying technical question, direct current versus alternating current, and Edison's decision to fight that question not with engineering, but with fear. The technical background requires a brief explanation. Edison's entire distribution system operated on direct current at 110 volts. This was safe and reliable at the point of consumption, but severely limited in transmission range. The practical radius of a Pearl Street type station was approximately 1 mile. Beyond that distance, the resistance of the copper conductors caused such a drop in voltage that the system became uneconomical regardless of how cleverly the feeder and main arrangement was designed. Alternating current, by contrast, could be stepped up to high voltages for long-distance transmission using transformers, then stepped back down to safe levels at the point of use. A generating station using alternating current could serve not a 1 mile radius, but a 10-mile radius or more, a difference that made the economics of electric power distribution fundamentally different. It was this advantage that William Stanley had demonstrated at Great Barrington, Massachusetts, in 1886, using transformers developed from the Gaulard and Gibbs patents that Westinghouse had purchased. Edison knew about alternating current. He had been offered the rights to the European ZBD transformer system, named after its inventors Zipanowski, Blathy, and Derry, in 1886. His own engineer, Francis Upton, went to Europe to examine it and recommended purchase. Edison rejected the option. He had committed himself, physically and financially, to direct current infrastructure, his lamp factories, his dynamo works, his Pearl Street station, the dozens of central stations being installed across the country under his system. All of it was direct current. To acknowledge that alternating current was superior for long-distance distribution was, in practical terms, to acknowledge that a significant portion of what he had built would need to be rebuilt. He chose instead to argue that alternating current was dangerous. There was a real foundation for this concern. Arc lighting systems using alternating current at 2000 volts had been responsible for a number of fatal electrocutions, and the higher voltages being discussed for the new transmission systems, 5000, 10,000 volts, were genuinely lethal if insulation failed or lines were accidentally grounded. Edison's preference for low-voltage direct current had always been motivated partly by genuine safety concerns. His underground distribution system in New York was specifically designed to eliminate the danger of overhead wires that had killed linemen on arc light poles. The problem was not the concern. The problem was what he did with it. Beginning in 1887 and accelerating through 1888 and 1889, Edison and his associates conducted a deliberate public campaign designed to terrify the general population about alternating current. At the laboratory in West Orange, stray dogs and cats were purchased from local schoolboys at 25 cents each and electrocuted with alternating current in front of invited newspaper reporters. The local animal population, by Edison's own account, was brought to the edge of decimation. Charles Batchelor, during one of these demonstrations, accidentally received a full shock himself and described the experience in terms that suggested genuine trauma, though he recovered without lasting physical injury. A figure named Harold Brown, described in contemporary accounts as a former laboratory assistant at West Orange and almost certainly operating with Edison's knowledge and support, gave public demonstrations in New York lecture halls in which large dogs were first subjected to direct current at various voltages, surviving, as Brown showed the audience, at levels that would have been fatal under alternating current, and then killed with alternating current at lower voltages. The intent was to establish in the public mind an association between alternating current and death that would make Westinghouse's systems commercially unacceptable. The campaign reached its most consequential expression in the lobbying around New York State's 1888 statute providing for the replacement of hanging with electrocution as the method of capital punishment. Brown, positioning himself as a scientific consultant to the state authorities, pushed specifically for the adoption of alternating current as the execution medium, and specifically for the purchase of Westinghouse alternators for the purpose. The logic was explicit and cynical. If the public came to associate alternating current with the state's machinery of death, Westinghouse's commercial prospects would be damaged accordingly. Westinghouse understood exactly what was happening and was furious. He wrote public letters arguing with considerable accuracy that out of 30 electrical fatalities documented in recent years, 16 had involved direct current systems, and none had occurred on any circuit using Westinghouse equipment. He pointed out that the Stanley transformers stepped high-voltage transmission current down to safe domestic levels before it entered any building, making the comparison with bare high-voltage arc-light wires misleading. He considered suing Edison for libel and was talked out of it by his attorneys. The electric chair was adopted. The first execution of a man named William Kemmler on the 6th of August 1890 was, by all contemporary accounts, a catastrophe. The initial charge was insufficient. The procedure had to be repeated. Witnesses described it as far worse than hanging. Westinghouse, whose generators had been used over his explicit objection, said publicly that it had been a disgrace. Edison's response to the Kemmler execution was muted. He had already, by that point, begun to recognise privately that the campaign against alternating current had been both wrong and futile. The engineering reality was simply too clear. Younger engineers, Tesla, Charles Steinmetz, Benjamin Lammer, understood the mathematics of polyphase, alternating current systems in ways that Edison genuinely did not and could not, given his lifelong resistance to the mathematics required. Frank Sprague and others who had worked in Edison's own circle had long since moved toward alternating current development. When Edison's associate Edward Dean Adams, a knowledgeable Boston financier, offered to take him to Pittsburgh personally to see what was being done at the Westinghouse plant, Edison refused and sent back a scorching telegram accusing Westinghouse of having gone crazy over sudden accession of wealth. His own trusted consultant, Dr. Arthur Kennelly, along with Frank Sprague, reportedly pleaded with him to reconsider. He remained, in Edward Johnson's word, granitic. The final verdict came not from a court or a public debate, but from the marketplace. By 1892, Westinghouse had won the contract to light the Chicago World's Fair with alternating current, 200,000 lamps. By 1895, the Niagara Falls hydroelectric project, the largest electrical installation in the world, was completed using Westinghouse alternating current generators and Tesla's polyphase system. The power of Niagara Falls, distributed across western New York in quantities that Edison's direct current system could never have transmitted, announced the definitive resolution of the technical question. While the war of currents was being fought in the press and the lecture halls and the state legislature, a quieter battle was being waged inside the Edison organization itself, one whose outcome would prove in the long run far more consequential for Edison personally than anything Westinghouse or Tesla ever did to him. It had been building for years. The Edison electrical enterprise by the late 1880s was not a single company. It was a loose, often fractious federation of interlocking organizations. The Edison Electric Light Company, which held the patents and licensed them to local utilities. The Edison Lamp Company, which manufactured bulbs. The Edison Machine Works at Schenectady, which produced dynamos and heavy equipment. Bergman and Company, which made fixtures, sockets and appliances, and the Edison Illuminating Company of New York, which operated the Pearl Street Station and its successors. Edison and his partners, Batchelor, Upton, Bergman, Johnson, owned substantial stakes in the manufacturing companies. The Morgan Group and the Vanderbilt interests controlled the patent holding company. The structural tension between these two halves of the enterprise was chronic and worsening. The manufacturing companies needed capital to expand and meet growing orders. The patent holding company, under its conservative banking directors, was reluctant to invest. Edison, trying to borrow money from Drexel, Morgan and Company to buy copper for the machine works, found himself paying emergency interest rates of 20% when the bankers called loans at inopportune moments. He wrote to Henry Villard with the controlled fury of a man who had run out of polite language. He spoke of the leaden collar of the Edison Electric Light Company around his neck, preventing him from doing his work properly. Henry Villard, the railroad magnate, former war correspondent, representative of German banking interests, had been watching the Edison situation with increasing attention since the early 1880s. He had backed the electric locomotive experiments at Menlo Park. He had encouraged Edison through the difficult years of the lighting system's development, and he now saw, with the strategic clarity of a practiced financial operator, that the Edison electrical companies were undervalued, underleveraged, and ripe for reorganization under a unified structure that could attract serious capital. In 1889, after extensive negotiation, Villard orchestrated the formation of the Edison General Electric Company, consolidating the manufacturing units and the patent holding company into a single organization. Edison and his partners received their manufacturing stakes converted into shares of the new company, plus cash. Edison personally realized approximately $1,750,000 from the transaction, the largest single payment of his life to that point, and a genuine relief from the financial pressures that had been grinding at him for years. He later said that the greatest inducement of the whole arrangement had been the cash, which freed his mind from financial stress and allowed him to return to purely technical work, given what he had endured: chronic borrowing, emergency payrolls, the constant anxiety of meeting obligations for a workforce of 2,000 to 3,000 people, on the strength of patent revenues that were perpetually being disputed in court. This is entirely credible. What he perhaps did not fully reckon with was the implication of selling a controlling interest. He retained approximately 10% of the new company's stock. The Morgan Group retained their position. Villard, backed by German capital from the Deutsche Bank and the Siemens interests, became president. Edison was a director and the company's inventive figurehead, honoured, consulted on technical matters, and increasingly peripheral to actual decisions. The situation deteriorated further over the following 3 years. The Edison General Electric's chief competitor, the Thomson-Houston Company of Lynn, Massachusetts, had been building its business with ruthless efficiency under Charles Coffin, a former shoe salesman who had turned out to be one of the most capable industrial managers of his generation. Thomson-Houston had entered the incandescent lighting field as a straightforward patent infringer, and had then, under Coffin's direction, expanded into arc lighting, electric railways, and alternating current power systems with a speed and commercial effectiveness that left the Edison organisation struggling to keep pace. By 1891, Thomson-Houston's annual profits, as a percentage of capital, were approximately 50% higher than Edison General Electric's. The legal situation had also reached a crisis point. Years of patent litigation over the carbon filament lamp had produced, finally, in July of 1891, a clear federal court victory for Edison. Judge Wallace ruled definitively that Edison's priority was complete and that his competitors had been infringing his patents. It was a genuine triumph, the vindication of a 7-year legal campaign that had cost approximately $2 million. It was also, in practical terms, nearly worthless. The lamp patent had only about 2 years of life remaining. By the time injunctions could be enforced and royalty agreements negotiated, the patent would expire and the whole commercial advantage would evaporate. The Morgan Group drew the appropriate conclusion. Edison General Electric, for all its prestige and its inventor's fame, was carrying a floating debt of $3.5 million, was late to alternating current technology, and was facing a competitor that was in several respects better managed. The solution, from Morgan's perspective, was obvious: consolidation. Villard negotiated. Coffin negotiated. The details were worked out in private meetings that Edison was not part of and was not adequately informed about. When the terms were finalised in early 1892, it emerged that Thomson-Houston, the smaller company by capitalisation, had effectively absorbed Edison General Electric, rather than the reverse. Of the $35 million in new stock issued for the combined company, Thomson-Houston's shareholders received $18.4 million, and Edison General Electric's shareholders received $15 million, with the remainder covering assumed debts. Coffin became the chief executive. Most of Edison's old associates in management positions were removed, and the name of the new company was to be the General Electric Company. Edison's name, which had for 14 years been synonymous in America and throughout the world with electric light, was simply dropped from the title. He learned about it from a newspaper, not from Villard, not from Morgan, not from any member of the board he sat on. From a reporter who called his office for a comment. His secretary Tate, who was present, wrote afterward, "Something had died in Edison's heart. His pride had been wounded. He had a deep-seated, enduring pride in his name. And this name had been violated, torn from the title of the great industry, created by his genius through years of intensive planning and unremitting toil. Edison himself said almost nothing publicly. He issued a brief statement denying that he had been mistreated or deceived, a statement that was, in the circumstances, either an act of dignity or an act of self-protection, and possibly both. He resigned from the board of the new General Electric Company shortly afterward and never attended another of its meetings. The ore milling project deserves its full accounting, because it is the part of Edison's story that his admirers most consistently skip and his critics most consistently misread. Beginning in 1889 and continuing for the better part of a decade, Edison poured approximately $2 million, most of his personal fortune from the General Electric sale, into a scheme to extract iron ore from low-grade deposits in the mountains of northern New Jersey, using giant electromagnetic separators of his own design. The idea was commercially coherent in its original conception. The high-grade iron ore deposits of the American East were being exhausted, while the Midwest steel industry was consuming ore at an accelerating rate. If low-grade eastern ore could be processed cheaply enough, the resulting product could compete on price with ore shipped from the Lake Superior ranges. Edison built a processing plant at Ogden, New Jersey. He designed crushing rollers that reduced raw rock to powder, magnetic separators that pulled iron particles from that powder, and briquetting machines that compressed the separated iron into dense blocks suitable for furnace loading. The engineering was genuinely original. Several of the specific mechanisms he designed at Ogden had no precedent and represented real inventive achievement. The project failed anyway, for a reason that had nothing to do with the quality of the engineering. While Edison was building and refining his processing plant through the early 1890s, the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota was opened for large-scale mining. The Mesabi ore was extraordinarily rich, extraordinarily accessible, and could be extracted and shipped to Pittsburgh at a cost that Edison's processed New Jersey ore could not approach, regardless of how efficiently his plant operated. The economic foundation of the entire venture dissolved beneath him before he had finished building it. He spent years refusing to accept this. He made improvement after improvement to the plant, drove down his processing costs repeatedly, and watched the gap between his production cost and the Mesabi price remain stubbornly unbridgeable. He lived at the site for extended periods, sleeping in a wooden shack, eating with his workers, running on 4 hours of sleep and enthusiasm that his staff found increasingly difficult to share. He lost the $2 million. He later said, with the specific equanimity he reserved for his largest failures, that it had been a great experience. What sustained him financially through the Ogden years was the West Orange Laboratory, specifically the phonograph and eventually motion pictures. The West Orange Laboratory, completed in 1887, was on a scale that dwarfed Menlo Park. The main building ran 250 feet long, 3 stories high, 60,000 square feet of floor space. The library held 10,000 volumes. 4 additional long single-story structures flanked the main building around a central courtyard. It was, as Edison had designed it to be, a factory for inventions, organized, departmentalized, staffed by 45 to 60 specialists, ranging from chemical consultants to draftsmen to glass blowers. The improved phonograph consumed most of 1887 and 1888. The Bell-Tainter graphophone, which had been developed at Alexander Bell's Washington laboratory during the decade Edison had set the phonograph aside, was a genuine competitive threat with real technical improvements, particularly the use of wax recording cylinders over tin foil. Edison attacked the problem with characteristic intensity, going back to basics, redesigning the recording stylus, developing a wax cylinder compound through hundreds of chemical trials with his consultant John Aylesworth, inventing a floating weight pickup mechanism, and devising a gold vacuum deposition process for duplicating master records in large quantities. The famous 5-day vigil of June 1888, widely publicised at the time, commemorated in a photograph of Edison sprawled over his workbench with tousled hair, looking like a man who had just survived something, was real, though the 5 days were actually closer to 72 hours. The photograph became one of the most reproduced images of his career. He understood its value and did nothing to correct the duration. What he did not fully understand, and would not understand for years, was what the phonograph was actually for. He continued to insist it was a business dictation machine. The market kept telling him it was a music machine. The Nickelodeon operators who installed coin slot phonographs in their establishments in the early 1890s, playing comic dialogues and popular songs to paying customers, were pointing clearly toward the correct answer. Edison watched this development with something between skepticism and mild disapproval, and continued designing improvements oriented toward office use. Motion pictures arrived at West Orange through a combination of deliberate research and the specific capacities of a young assistant named William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. Edison had been thinking about moving images since at least 1887, when he wrote a laboratory note proposing a device that would do for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. The concept was clear from the outset. The execution required solving a series of photographic and mechanical problems that were not obvious, and Dixon, who was both a skilled photographer and a capable engineer, spent 2 years on the problem while Edison was occupied with phonographs, ore milling, and the corporate battles surrounding General Electric. When Edison returned from his European tour in October of 1889, Dixon had a demonstration ready. He darkened a room at the laboratory, started a projection apparatus, and showed Edison a moving image of Dixon himself, tipping his hat and speaking a greeting. The sound synchronized, imperfectly but recognizably, with the phonograph attached to the projector. Edison sat in the dark and watched a man on a screen move and speak. His first kinetoscope patent was filed in 1891. The device was a peephole viewer, a cabinet into which one person at a time could look and see 50 feet of moving film loop, lasting approximately 20 seconds. Edison chose deliberately not to develop a projection system that would throw images onto a screen for an audience. He believed characteristically that the per-person revenue of individual peephole viewers would exceed the per-person revenue of projected shows. He was wrong. When the Lumiere brothers in France demonstrated projected motion pictures to a paying audience in December of 1895, the arc of the industry was settled. Within 2 years, Edison had reversed course and developed his own projection system, but he had surrendered the initiative he had held. The personal dimension of these middle years is not separable from the professional one. Mary Edison, his first wife, died of typhoid fever in August of 1884 at the age of 29. She had spent most of their marriage in the quiet isolation of Menlo Park, seeing her husband rarely, managing 3 children largely alone, reconciling herself with evident grace to a life organised entirely around someone else's work. Edison was at her bedside when she died. His daughter Marion recalled finding him that morning, shaking with grief, weeping and sobbing so he could hardly tell me that mother had died in the night. He married Mina Miller in February of 1886, the daughter of an Akron industrialist and philanthropist. 18 years his junior, accomplished, strong-willed, and entirely clear-eyed about what she was taking on. He proposed to her in Morse code, tapping the question on her hand during a carriage ride through the White Mountains of New Hampshire, while 3 other people sat in the same carriage, unaware of what was being said. She tapped back yes. Glenmont, the sprawling red-painted Victorian mansion in Llewellyn Park, West Orange, which he purchased for her, originally built at a cost of $200,000 and acquired by Edison for a fraction of that when its previous owner fled the country to escape his creditors, was, as Edison himself said with genuine self-awareness, a great deal too nice for me. Henry Ford first met Edison in 1896 at a convention of Edison Illuminating Company engineers in New York, where Ford, then a young mechanical superintendent at the Detroit Edison plant, described to the inventor his experiments with a gasoline-powered horseless carriage. Edison brought his fist down on the table and said, "Young man, that's the thing. You have it." Ford later said those words from Edison gave him more encouragement than anything else in his life up to that point. He kept them with him for 40 years. Their friendship, which deepened after 1909 and became one of the genuine emotional anchors of Edison's later life, was built on a specific dynamic. Ford's reverence was absolute, and Edison received it with the comfortable ease of a man who had long since made peace with being admired. Edison called him Henry. Ford never addressed the inventor as anything other than Mr. Edison. Around the campfire on their annual summer camping tours, joined by Harvey Firestone, and until his death in 1921, the naturalist John Burroughs. Edison read books while Ford chopped wood, and Firestone sold tyres to whoever happened to be nearby. Burroughs wrote of Edison on these trips with genuine affection, a man who turns vagabond easily, sleeping in his clothes, washing in a brook, trenchant and original in conversation, to whom the rest of the party instinctively deferred. The storage battery consumed 9 years of Edison's working life between 1900 and 1909, 50,000 individual experiments by his own count, a figure the laboratory notebooks support. He was trying to develop an alkaline nickel-iron battery superior in every respect to the lead-acid battery then in common use, lighter, more durable, capable of more charge cycles, and free from the sulfuric acid that made lead-acid cells dangerous and corrosive. He succeeded eventually. The Edison storage battery worked. It was genuinely better than lead-acid in several important respects. It was also for the application that would have made it transformatively important. Too late and slightly wrong. Ford had contracted with Edison in 1914 to equip the Model T with Edison batteries for its self-starter and electric lighting system, an order that would have involved 100,000 units and represented a commercial validation of enormous scale. The alkaline battery's voltage characteristics proved incompatible with the automobile's electrical requirements. After extensive testing, the arrangement was quietly abandoned by mutual agreement. Neither man made a public issue of it. Their friendship absorbed the failure without apparent damage. The rubber project of Edison's final years has the particular quality of an old man's last adventure: genuinely purposeful, methodically executed, and ultimately foredoomed by forces entirely outside the laboratory. Ford and Firestone, concerned about American dependence on tropical rubber supplies that could be disrupted by war or colonial restriction, approached Edison in the mid-1920s with a proposal. They would fund a botanical research company if Edison would lead the search for a domestic rubber producing plant that could be cultivated and harvested within the continental United States. The Edison Botanic Research Company was organized in 1927, with Ford and Firestone each contributing $93,500. Edison examined over 14,000 plant species over 4 years. He settled on goldenrod, the same plant that had grown in the empty lots near the railway depots of his telegrapher youth, as the most promising candidate. Through crossbreeding, he developed a variety that grew to 14 feet in height and yielded approximately 12% latex by weight, compared to the wild plant's 5%. He was genuinely happy in this work. Mina Edison later said that during these years, everything in the family turned to rubber. Conversations, correspondence, the atmosphere of their Florida winter home at Fort Myers. The project was foredoomed not by bad science, but by economics. The German chemical industry had by the mid-1920s developed synthetic rubber processes, the butadiene and sodium methods of the IG Farben laboratories, that were capable, given sufficient capital investment, of producing rubber at costs no plant-based domestic alternative could match. Edison knew about these processes. He judged the required investment prohibitive. He was correct in his assessment of the economics at the time. He was also, though he did not live to see it confirmed, correct that only government subsidy would eventually make synthetic rubber production feasible on the required scale. That confirmation came in 1940, 9 years after his death. He fell seriously ill in the summer of 1929. Uremia, Bright's disease, diabetes and a gastric ulcer, discovered in a thorough medical examination that his physicians found both clarifying and somewhat astonishing, given how long he had apparently been functioning with all 4 conditions simultaneously. He recovered sufficiently to attend Light's Golden Jubilee at Henry Ford's Greenfield Village in October of 1929, where he reenacted the invention of the carbon filament lamp before an audience that included President Herbert Hoover, J.P. Morgan the Younger, Madame Curie, and Orville Wright. He died at 3:24 in the morning on October 18, 1931, in the bedroom of Glenmont, with Mina Edison at his side. In the final weeks, when he could no longer work and could no longer easily leave his bed, he sat sometimes in a chair by the tall windows of his room, overlooking the lawn and the beaches of Llewellyn Park. His son Charles made periodic visits upstairs and returned to report to the people waiting below. The phrase he used each time, borrowed without apparent awareness from the men who had kept watch over the carbon filament lamp at Menlo Park 52 years earlier, was, "The light still burns." When it went out, the radio, a technology Edison had dismissed, declined to develop and been commercially damaged by, carried the news to every corner of the world within hours. The proposal to mark his passing by, turning off all electrical power in the United States for 1 minute, was raised by officials in the days following his death and almost immediately abandoned. The reason given was practical. The electrical grid had by 1931 become so deeply integrated into the functioning of hospitals, railways, water systems and industrial processes that even a brief voluntary interruption carried genuine risk of cascading failure and loss of life. The tribute could not be paid because the thing being honoured had become too essential to interrupt. President Hoover suggested instead that Americans dim their lights voluntarily at 10 o'clock on the evening of the funeral. Many did. Now the accounting. 1,093 patents across a working life of approximately 60 years. The phonograph. The carbon filament incandescent lamp. The carbon telephone transmitter, without which Bell's telephone would have remained a scientific curiosity of limited range and usefulness. The first central electric power station and the distribution system that made it work. The kinetoscope and the foundations of motion picture technology. The Industrial Research Laboratory as an organised institution, perhaps in terms of its long-term influence on how humanity produces new knowledge and new technology, the most consequential of all his inventions, the practical democratic standard he imposed on his own work, that an invention must serve a genuine need, must be manufacturable at a cost ordinary people can afford, must be reliable enough for daily use by people with no technical knowledge, was not merely a commercial preference. It was a philosophy of applied science that changed what applied science was for. Before Edison, the dominant model of invention was essentially aristocratic. a lone genius inspired by providence, producing breakthroughs in isolation. After Edison, the dominant model was the organized research laboratory, systematic, staffed, resourced and oriented towards specific commercial objectives. Every corporate research and development department in the world today is, in some meaningful sense, a descendant of the wooden building that went up on a New Jersey hillside in 1876. The debits are real and should not be softened. The War of Currents was a sustained campaign of deliberate public deception, conducted with Edison's knowledge and at least partial direction, that caused genuine harm to animals, to reputations, and most concretely to William Kemmler, who died badly in a botched execution that was itself partly the product of political lobbying Edison had supported. The belated private acknowledgement that it had been a mistake does not undo the damage. The question of credit is genuinely complicated and cannot be resolved cleanly in either direction. Edison did not simply steal other people's work. The core inventive insights in his most important patents originated with him and are documented in notebooks that predate any competing claims. But the labour of Batchelor, Crucy, Upton, and dozens of others was systematically converted into patents bearing one name, with compensation that was real but not proportionate, and with public recognition that was almost non-existent. The men who built the things Edison imagined spent their lives in the shadow of a name that was partly legitimately theirs. His treatment of his children by his first marriage, whom he saw rarely, educated poorly by deliberate philosophical choice, and disappointed repeatedly by the specific combination of high expectation and sustained absence that is perhaps the most common way that driven men fail their families, left marks that his surviving children documented honestly and without particular bitterness, which is itself a kind of generosity toward him that he may not have fully earned. And yet, the lights came on, not metaphorically, literally. In 1882, Lower Manhattan ran on gaslight and candles. In 1931, when Edison died, electric light and electric power had reached into the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people across the industrialized world, changing the structure of the working day, the character of the home, the possibilities of medicine, manufacturing and communication in ways that continue to compound. He did not do this alone. He could not have. No single person could. But the specific sequence of insights, high resistance filaments, parallel circuits, central station distribution, the feeder and main system, that made electric light economically viable for ordinary people rather than wealthy institutions. Those insights were his, documented in his hand on specific dates in notebooks that survive. In his last coherent days, a nurse asked Edison whether he had given thought to a life beyond death. He considered the question with the honest seriousness he had always given to questions he could not answer by experiment. "It does not matter," he said quietly. "No one knows." He was right. It was one of the most reliably Edisonian things he ever said, empirical to the last, refusing to claim knowledge he did not have, at peace with uncertainty in a way that his working life, with its thousands of failed experiments and its stubborn insistence on trying again, had perhaps prepared him for better than any philosophy could. The lights in the rooms of Glenmont were electric. They had been for 50 years. If you found this documentary valuable, if this honest, evidence-based account of one of history's most consequential lives gave you something worth keeping, please consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting. Hit the bell. Share it with someone who would want to know.